Okay, thank you, Tom. Um, and actually, there isn't that much difference between Antietam and Gettysburg in this regard. It's just less known. Um, so let me share my screen. Let's not forget to do that, Jim. So we go here. Okay, we start the slideshow. I said, yes. All right, now we're cooking with gas. I had to rehearse this. Okay, the Great Slave Hunt of 1863. This is a story that is not widely known and not widely talked about. I first became aware of it when I was in graduate school, but didn't start really studying it until the 90s. The 5-second, one slide version of the talk would go as follows: that during the Gettysburg campaign, while Lee's army was in Pennsylvania, the troops of the army pretty much scooped up as many African Americans as they could get their hands on. They didn't care if they were known to be runaways or known to be free blacks in Pennsylvania. They didn't care. This was done by pretty much every element of Lee's army, and it went on pretty much for the entire campaign. But it is not widely known for a lot of reasons. Okay, now I gave you all in the newsletter a map, and I asked you to bring it because I am not going to come back to this slide. But this is the rough geography that we're going to talk about. I highlighted the important towns. Hagerstown in Maryland was kind of the staging area for the invasion. Greencastle and Chambersburg were the two places that I'm going to talk most about tonight for no particular reason. There was also some well-documented activity in Mercersburg and some in Gettysburg. The first thing we'll talk about is Chambersburg. And so here we have Confederate General Albert Gallatin Jenkins and his beard. That is one of the most epic beards I have ever seen. Tom, is there a problem?
Yes, we're still at the Great Slave Hunt title page.
Oh, really? Because okay, let me fix that. I think I know what's happening. Is that it?
There's A.G. Jenkins and his beard.
Okay. That happened during my rehearsal as well. Muted. I don't know why. Well, Jenkins' brigade swept into Chambersburg on the night of June 15th. They arrived around 11 o'clock. And we know about what they did mostly because of Jacob Hoke, who was a Chambersburg businessman, and he chronicled the activities of Lee's army during the invasion. However, the best source for what happened is a young woman named Rachel Cormany, who kept a diary. Her husband was serving as a Pennsylvania cavalryman in the Army of the Potomac. And so she writes about the activities on the 16th. Soon, however, the Confederates became more active, were hunting up the contrabands and driving them off by droves. I saw no men among the contrabands, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. A diarist in Jenkins' brigade described the activities of this day by his troops as boys capturing Negroes and horses. A Chambersburg newspaper, one Chambersburg newspaper, I should say, estimated that perhaps as many as 50 blacks were sent south by Jenkins. There's another account that says as many as 250. Nobody was taking counts. Nobody was doing a census for all of this. And I should have mentioned this while we had the title slide up. I'm going to use the language that the people used. Fortunately, I don't have to use any language that it would be considered offensive, but it is going to vary. I'm going to quote what words the people used. Regardless, fortunately, as I said, the one quote where I could have used something awful, I decided not to. Anyway, let me give you some data on the area. Franklin County, which is where Chambersburg is located, the census showed it had a black population of just south of 1,800. Gettysburg, or rather Adams County, was less than 500. It is probably the case that many of these people were escaped slaves. It's very close to Virginia and just across the Mason-Dixon line from Maryland. The notion that most people who escaped slavery moved far north into Canada to get away from the border isn't entirely true. A Chambersburg newspaper, the Franklin Repository, mentioned in its June 14th edition that there were dark clouds of contrabands streaming north as a result of the Confederate incursion towards Winchester, Virginia, which led to the Second Battle of Winchester on June 14th. And there's something important here about the timing on this, at least in my opinion. The Battle of Second Winchester was on June 14th. If the Confederates don't win that, and they were going to win it, they weren't fighting a large force. But if they don't win that, they really cannot move forward into Maryland or Pennsylvania. But Jenkins was sent ahead. He was in Maryland on the 14th. He entered Pennsylvania on the 15th, reaching Chambersburg about 11 o'clock, and he passed through Greencastle on the 6th, at 6. So he's way ahead of the main body of the army. Now, some very interesting things happened in Greencastle on the 16th. During the day, a collection of about, excuse me, I'm getting a little bit better positioned here. A collection of about 30 to 40 Black women and children were brought to Greencastle in a series of wagons. They were escorted by 4 soldiers, and I kid you not, a chaplain was the commanding officer. These are from Jenkins' brigade. The local citizenry of Greencastle overpowered the 4 guards, put them in jail. Some accounts say the Greencastle jail, other accounts say Waynesboro. And the blacks were freed and told, go to Gettysburg, go to Mercersburg, get away from here. A man named Tom Pauling is usually credited with leading this effort. He was a prominent and very vehement abolitionist. He owned a restaurant called the Antrim House that was very highly regarded in Greencastle. After they jailed the Confederates, the townspeople began to think that that was a bad idea, so they released them. Immediately upon being released, the chaplain goes postal on the city or on the town. He's screaming that those people were his personal property, and he wants them back, or he wants $50,000 in cash to compensate him. Nobody says anything. Okay, I'll take $25,000 or I'm going to burn the town. At which point somebody says something about nobody's going to participate in the slave trade. The town was not burned. On the 17th, Jenkins' brigade returns south. They pick up these 5 people and head on. So this is one act of resistance, for lack of a better term, that occurred. Later, about a week later, when Confederate infantry had crossed the river and entered Greencastle, we have this entry in the diary of a Charles Hartman, who was a city councilor in Greencastle and a local merchant. One of the exciting features of the day was the scouring of the fields about town and searching of houses for Negroes. In some cases, the Negroes were rescued from the guards. Squire Kaufman and Tom Pauling did this, and if they had been caught, the rebels would have killed them. Now, it's not known for certain who was doing this. Rhodes' Infantry Division entered Greencastle on the 22nd. So if it was infantry, that's who it would have been. But in other parts of his diary, Hartman talks about horsemen, men on horseback, being used to chase the Black people through the fields. So it might have been cavalry. There was a cavalry regiment detached from Fitz-Lee's division that was traveling with Rhodes' division. So that's possible. Things were equally ugly to the westward. And here, the perpetrators, if you will, were the Virginia Cavalry Brigade commanded by John Imboden. And the primary source for what went on is the cleric Philip Schaff. Schaff was born in Switzerland, educated in Germany, and came to the United States in 1843 to run the Mercersburg German Reformed Theological Seminary. And he first of all kept a diary, and second of all, he published an article about all of this in Scribner's magazine that appeared in, I think, 1909. It's in the bibliography that I put in the newsletter. Imboden's brigade was not regular cavalry. Some of them were mounted infantry. There was one group that styled itself McNeil's Partisan Rangers. They were not a disciplined bunch. And when they came to Mercersburg, and they came in several waves, the troops went house to house looking for runaway slaves or even local free Blacks. McNeil's Partisan Rangers were some of the worst perpetrators. There was also a regiment commanded by a man named Ferguson, which I think might have been the 16th Virginia, that were doing all of this. Schaff indicates that at least 3 men, and this is interesting phrasing on his part, Sam Brooks, Finley Cuff, John Philkill, known to have lived in the town for years. That doesn't mean they were born there. That doesn't mean they were known to be free people of color, to use the jargon of the day, but they had lived in town for a long time. He also described it as the worst spectacle I ever saw in the war, a most pitiful sight, and said that one of the Confederate soldiers said that all they were doing was reclaiming their own property, which we had stolen and harbored. This was a very personal thing for Reverend Schaff, because his housekeeper was a Black woman, and she would spend the days the day when the Confederates were around, hiding out in the woods with her son. And she came back at night to sleep and get some food. Her daughter, who apparently lived independently, wasn't so lucky. They caught her and her children, and she was seen being marched south when the Confederates left. Now, a good source for this stuff are newspaper accounts. One of the most explicit ones comes from the Charleston Mercury. And I need to be clear, this is Charleston, South Carolina, not Charleston, West Virginia. Now, the article is dated July 8th, which of course is after the battle. But it indicates that it was filed from Hagerstown on June 27th. And the reporter says, yesterday I met several gangs of Negroes going to the rear who had been captured in the mountains in Maryland and Pennsylvania. This probably would be the people from Mercersburg, because it would take some time to walk from Mercersburg down to Hagerstown. There are several articles in the New York Times, which was not the paper that it is today. It was a relatively young newspaper at the time. There's one referring to Stuart's cavalry having captured a wagon train in Rockville, Maryland, and taken perhaps 150 colored men who were the teamsters on the wagon train prisoner. Now, taking such men prisoner and treating them as prisoners of war would not be out of bounds. Teamsters on wagon trains were not enrolled soldiers at this time. They were hired contract workers by the Army. Now in the South, they were slaves, usually. In the North, they were hired, typically free men of color. The Lancaster Daily Express in Pennsylvania has an interesting commentary that a correspondent from Chambersburg wrote that some of the Confederates told them, all we're going to do is we're going to take as many of your free colored people south as we can, and we're going to hold them hostage to trade for our slaves that ran away. And they tied them up by ropes and led them along in gangs. A Confederate correspondent, a different Confederate correspondent, wrote that there were sizable numbers of civilians following Lee's army because they intended to look for their runaway slaves in Pennsylvania, that they knew they'd lost people and that's what they were doing. Seems an odd way to spend a military campaign following an army into battle. Now, there are numerous other incidents. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first one here because it is an amusing and interesting story. A young man named Albertus McCreary was about 15 years old at the time of the battle. And when he was very old, he wrote and published an account of what he saw as a 15-year-old during the 3 days of July. Now, there's lots of errors in his account, but he tells the story, lots of detail errors, things that, no, this couldn't have happened on July 2nd, it had to happen on July 1st or vice versa, stuff like that. But this is a very in-depth story that he tells. He describes seeing his family laundress, who he knew as Old Liz. And she was in a column of other colored people, as he put it, from Gettysburg, who were being guarded by Confederate soldiers. And he asked her, Liz, what's going on? And she says, we're going back south to slavery. and says it with a very sad expression, which kind of is a suggestion, since that is the way she said it. We're going back to slavery, that perhaps she herself was a runaway. Now, one of the sources that I used did a little work in the Adams County Census and figures that old Liz was a woman named Elizabeth Butler. She was about 50 years old. She had a husband who was a wagoner. She had children. She eventually had grandchildren. Nobody knows what happened to them. She did escape. At some point, while this column was making its way out of Gettysburg, they stopped in front of a church and the guards were not paying attention. She ducked in the church, ran up the steeple, and hid in the steeple for 2 days until the battle was over and the Confederates had gone, and then she came down. Gettysburg, the library at the park has an entire entry of several items relating to this account, but unfortunately, the library is closed due to COVID. So a friend of mine who lives in Gettysburg couldn't go and look at it for me, or I might have some more information about this. Now, this is not the first time this happened, and I am going to make some distinction between Tom's account of the Antietam campaign. During the Maryland campaign, same thing happened, just not on as large a scale because they weren't in free territory. Jedediah Hotchkiss, Stonewall Jackson's map maker, wrote a letter to his wife in which he very bluntly says, we got about 1,500 slaves back when they captured Harper's Ferry. Similar things happened later when Jeb Stuart did his ride around McClellan in October of '62. Same thing happened in 1864 when McCausland raided north and tried to burn Chambersburg. This is something that the Confederates, particularly according to one source, the Virginia troops, were very interested in doing when they had a chance. There is one detailed account from the Harper's Ferry part of things that I'd like to tell you about. One of the regiments that was captured at Harper's Ferry was the 60th Ohio. It was commanded by a man named Trimble. And when the regiment left Ohio, there were 13 free blacks from the area in Ohio where it was raised who were hired to act as servants to the officers of the regiment. Colonel Trimble was very concerned that he be allowed to take these men out on parole with him when they marched out of Harper's Ferry. He went to A.P. Hill and got passes for each of the 13 free blacks that were servants in his regiment. If you've ever been to Harper's Ferry, to get from Harper's Ferry into Maryland, you cross the Potomac River, of course. There's a railroad bridge. And the bridge had a Confederate guard on it, commanded by a major. And the major stopped Colonel Trimble's regiment and ordered the guards to take the 13 black men. And Trimble explained, no. I've talked to your General Hill. I have passes for these men. We're allowed to take them on with us. And the major said some things. This is the one place where I could have quoted an ugly word and decided not to. That he declared that Major Trimble was a thief of a particular kind, and he was not inclined to obey the orders of General Hill, which strikes me as odd for a major to say, but Who knows? One of the terms of the surrender was that the officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. So Colonel Trimble had his pistol. Now, he never says in his account whether he had loaded it that morning. But what he did do is he pulled it, cocked it, pointed it right at the major's face and said, "These men are either coming with us or you're going to be dead." At which point the major backed down and the regiment went on its way. So this didn't start with the Gettysburg campaign entirely. Now, is there anything official about this? Yes, no, and it's an interesting story. The one thing that is extensively in the official records is this order. Actually, it's not an order. It's a piece of legislation passed by the Confederate Congress. The photographic piece is taken from the online OR archive held at a certain unmentionable university in a state to the south of us. And the people who put the OR together didn't do a good job in choosing fonts because the smallest font is the title of the act, which is an act to protect the rights of owners of slaves taken by or employed in the Army. Now, that's not really an accurate title. Now, the OR contains the entire piece of legislation, and I'm not going to show you all of that, but I am going to tell you what's in it. What it's about is it provides for a system of depots. There's supposed to be 5 depots in each Confederate state, and these depots are where recaptured slaves recaptured by the Confederate military, are to be sent. Furthermore, the act goes through a lengthy process describing how civilians can come forward and claim their supposed property, and if they can document it according to the way the act specifies, then they can take them home. And if nobody claims an alleged slave after a month, then the authorities at the depot can put them to work on so-called public works. The act, if you recall the previous slide, was passed in early March, March 6th or so. There is a circular order from Lee's adjutant, Walter Taylor, which did not get put in the OR. Dated March 21st, it's addressed generically to generals, meaning it was probably sent to every general in the Army, reminding them that this act has been passed and they should obey it. So in a sense, the Army marched north. This is a difference from Antietam. At the time the Army marched north in June, they had an order more or less telling them to do this. Now, an interesting question is, why was this never talked about? And I really think that is worth exploring to some extent. Jacob Hoke, whose portrait is on one of the first slides I showed, wrote a book about the Gettysburg campaign, which was published in 1873. And he talks about this happening in Chambersburg. So it's not that it was unknown. And the Cormany diaries existed. Schaff knew about, I mean, they hadn't been published yet. Philip Schaff was a prominent theologian. He knew about it. There had been numerous newspaper articles. Why did it remain unknown? This is my speculation. This isn't grounded on anybody else's opinion. This is Brother Epperson talking. if you look at Civil War history, for a long time, it emphasized what you might call a top-down approach, a great men of history approach, in which what was studied were the actions and the lives of the leaders of the armies, the leaders of the government, not the ordinary people. And when you do that, you don't see much of this happening because the generals don't talk about it much. I do want to emphasize, don't talk about it much. Secondly, the information was hidden in sources that had not been published. Diaries had not been published. We did not have libraries full of newspapers on microfilm. Letters collections were not widely published or transcribed. So a lot of what is now the nitty-gritty source material in archival locations wasn't available. A third issue is that the two competing themes of Civil War history for a long time, the Northern-oriented reconciliationist theme, let's make nice to the rebels because they admitted that we won, and the more Confederate-oriented lost cause theme, sort of a Confederate version of we were stabbed in the back, we didn't really lose, dominated most of Civil War literature, probably until the 1950s or 60s. And neither of those two themes was very comfortable talking about these issues. But my opinion is, frankly, that the most significant reason that this was not talked about was a typo. And I kid you not, a typo. Edwin Coddington wrote what is probably considered the gold standard history of the Battle of Gettysburg, the entire campaign. It was published in 1968. And on page 161, he has a single paragraph that details the events in Chambersburg when Jenkins' cavalry brigade first came to Chambersburg on June 16th. This was the first I had heard of this, was when I read Coddington's book in graduate school. Now, I was in graduate school to study mathematics, but I brought my copy of Coddington, which I had just bought, to read when I wasn't doing integral equations or whatever. And I got to this and I said, I've got to see the footnote. So I went to the footnote. And the published citation cites it to Official Records, Volume 2, Part 2, pages in the 700s. Well, anybody who knows the official records knows that Volume 2 is going to be First Bull Run, not the Battle of Gettysburg. Battle of Gettysburg is volume, I forget now, 20-something, late 20s, I forget. Anyway, until digital versions were available in the 1990s, and you could do a search engine, you could not find out that the actual document Coddington had cited was in volume 51. No, excuse me. Yes, 51. One of the late supplementary volumes. And this is the order that he's referring to. And I've quoted the order in full, even though only the last sentence bears on what I'm talking about tonight. Basically, this is the fateful order that brought Pickett from Chambersburg to Gettysburg. And at the very end, Longstreet's adjutant, Moxley Sorrell, tells Pickett the captured contrabands had better be brought forward, better be brought along with you for further disposition. Now, I would submit to you that if you're taking an entire infantry division to bring these people forward for further disposition, and you're bothering to tell the division commander to do this, we are not talking about a half dozen people. We're talking significant numbers. Now, like I said, I got interested in this in the 1990s. I went down the proverbial rabbit hole, tracing all sorts of sources and stuff. I've got a file folder full of stuff printed with a dot matrix printer from those days. And the result was this. This is an article that I published in Civil War Times in August of 2002. That's the cover. And you can see here on the table of contents page, the article, they gave it the title, Lee's Slave Makers, which I hated. They also rewrote it in a way that I really hated. But it's there. One of the people who helped me write this article was Ted Alexander. Ted, at the time, was the chief historian at Antietam. And I took a trip up there. I was living in Alabama at the time, spent 2 hours with Ted. He was very helpful. Ted unfortunately died last year, I think, of COVID-related issues. He was very helpful. He published his own book, or not book, his own article in North and South. His article is much better than mine, which is not at all surprising. This is the same treatment. This is his cover, and that's his title. And here is his article on the table of contents page. And when I was arguing with the people at the Observer about the title, I tried to point out other people have called it a slave hunt. Why can't I? They weren't moved. One thing that Ted has in his article that I did not even know of, and I'm, in a sense, I hate to finish with this, but it is chronologically at the very end of the story. It's very brutal. A lieutenant in the 6th Corps, the 2nd Vermont Infantry, wrote a letter to his wife on July 15th. Now, this is after the Confederate retreat. They're south of the river. The Federals are still in Maryland, cleaning up around the battlefield because the Confederates had just, or the area where the Confederates had been. And he writes a letter to his wife, and he describes how they found a dead Negro boy. That's the phrase he used. I should have put that in quote marks. In a barn, brutally tortured, dead. And he describes very explicitly what had been done to this man. And I'm not squeamish about things, but I didn't want to visit that upon my friends. What they did to this kid was brutal. And he ends the letter by saying, I understand the reason of the act to be because he would not go over the river with them. Filling in what he might mean by that with my own speculation, he just refused to march across the bridge. And so they, probably as an example to others, did this to him. So that is my presentation. Even if we had an exciting game to go to starting at 8 o'clock tonight, I would have made it in time. Unfortunately, we don't. Where do you stop recording? It's not giving me that. Oh, let me stop the,
there you go.
There we go. And where is the recording button? Where's the recording button? Oh, here we are. Got it.
A lady said the recording stopped.